Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, whose mercy is profound, whose kindness is forever. Because I am interested that what I am going to speak on should be followed by questions, I'll try to be as brief as possible. The role of Hadith in understanding Islam. The first important question which every thinking Muslim as well as non-Muslim must ask is, where does the message of Islam originate from? The answer is that the message of Islam that we get is from the Prophet of God, God's mercy be on him. He is the only source of religious knowledge that affects, influences us in religion. He gave the message of Islam in two forms. One was the Quran, which is the text, the word of God, and the other the Sunnah, which are the religious practices that the Prophet performed and he was emulated by his followers. So the religion of Islam is primarily based on these two sources. The two sources are what we call authentic. What it means is that now that we are distanced by something more than 1400 years from the Prophet, we still feel comfortable and confident that what we have in the name of Islam is the very same message that was given to us by the Prophet. And how this confidence on the authenticity of the message came about, because the message, the way it was delivered, satisfied two conditions, was up to two criteria. One criterion is the criterion of ijma, unanimity. The Quran as well as the Sunnah, like prayers, formal prayers, they were agreed upon by the entire group of the first generation Muslims, the companions of the Prophet. Likewise was the case with the Sunnah, like prayers, fasting, Hajj, and many other religious practices. The Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, performed them, and he was followed and emulated by all others. So there was complete agreement across the entire first generation. That agreement, ijma, was transmitted through a process which was uninterrupted. There was no gap whatsoever, which is what is called tawatur. So these two twin criteria of ijma and tawatur help us in feeling confident. Whether one believes in the message to be from God or not, one cannot reject the claim. They are both coming from the man who claimed to be the messenger of God in a way that we are confident that there have been no changes, alterations that have inserted, polluted the original message. So unanimity and uninterrupted continuity in the Quran and Sunnah is what makes them authentic. Where did Hadith come from? Quite often it so happens that Muslims, they think that Sunnah and Hadith are the same. Both expressions are used synonymously. The fact of the matter is that Hadith emerged quite naturally. The Prophet was the most important person for Muslims. He was the model of practicing Islam, belief in Islam. He explained Islam. No matter what he did was of utmost significance to Muslims, and therefore no wonder what he said and what he did was taken seriously by those who were around him. And how is it possible that they would not have transmitted information that people got from him, perceived, to the next generation? So this process of Hadith coming from the first generation to the next generation happened naturally. If you hear a lecture or you see something important, some incident taking place before your eyes, how is it possible to stop you from sharing it with others? So it was natural that whatever the Prophet was doing, whatever he was saying, whatever was happening around him was observed by some people and communicated to the next generation. So that is exactly what happened in the case of Hadith. It happened naturally. However, the manner it happened and it got transmitted to the subsequent generations, there was neither unanimity nor uninterrupted continuity in the case of Hadith the way it was done in the case of Quran and Sunnah. So, for one thing, not everybody transmitted what the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, said or did. In actual fact, there can be no one particular companion about whom you can say that he or she observed and heard everything that he said and did. Some people quite naturally heard a few things that he said, others heard others, and some of them, not all of them, not the majority of them, some of them chose to, and we are very grateful to them, chose to transmit, communicate that information that they observed to the next generation. But obviously, we are not talking of all of them doing it, like it happened in the case of the Quran, like it happened in the case of prayers, salat like Sunnah. Some people transmitted some information that they observed, and it was not available to everyone in the first 2 centuries. This information reservoir of knowledge, very important, was critically examined, tested for authenticity, and presented in compiled book forms in the 3rd century Hijrah, which really means that Hadith, this information about the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, his history, was most certainly available in the first 2 centuries of the Muslim history, but it was available to only a few people. Well, my guess is probably 5% of them, but not to everybody, like it was the case with the Quran and with the Sunnah. Now, what happened was that some scholars realized, they felt that it's extremely important that the information that is in circulation in the name of the Prophet should be first tested, checked for its authenticity, and then we should present our understanding of the fact as to whether we believe that the information is reliable or not. So there were many Hadith scholars who emerged in the 3rd century Hijrah. We know some of them are very well known, Bukhari, Muslim, we know Sahih Sitta, but there were many others. And what they primarily did was that they applied a few tests, they had a few criteria in order for them to decide as to whether a certain piece of information claiming to be originating from the Prophet, is it reliable or not? And they looked at, there were 2 criteria that were primarily put across. One is the criterion of riwayat, sanad, isnad, whereby the individuals who were involved in transmitting the message were checked. You see, for instance, in the 3rd century Hijrah, Imam Bukhari claimed that I have heard that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, said such and such thing. He doesn't make that statement alone. What he says is that I heard it from D, and D heard it from C, and C heard it from B, and B heard it from A, and A heard it from, for instance, Abu Huraira radiyallahu anhu, that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, said such and such thing. Now, how should we feel confident that A, B, C, D said the right thing. All that could have been done was that their character, their memory, their knowledge, and the possibility of D meeting C and C meeting B should be checked. And that is exactly what they did. And to the best of their knowledge and to the best of their sincerity, they came to the conclusion that these people are reliable. And therefore, this piece of information should be considered as reliable. There can never ever be complete 100% certainty that can be declared about such pieces of information. However, as best as was possible for humans to do, they did their job. And this was the criterion of riwayat. Likewise, there were some scholars who also applied the criterion of darayat. So they looked at the question as to whether the piece of information which is claiming to be emerging from the Prophet was consistent with the Quran, Sunnah and other Hadith, and also with common sense. So that's how the work of Hadith proceeded, and it became well known, and people were extremely impressed by the amount of work that they did, the sacrifices that they made, the kind of honesty that people came to learn about in the task that they were performing. And therefore, gradually, this work became very popular, and it attracted the attention of a large number of Muslims. But what are the problems with these? Despite the immense popularity of Hadith and the fact that it indeed is a very impressive area of learning, understanding, one might say that probably no other community has done as much of hard work and research in trying to find the authenticity of information as these people have done in the case of Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. The fact of the matter is that unlike the case of the Quran and Sunnah, this piece of information, this reservoir of knowledge has certain problems, weaknesses. For instance, when narrations are mentioned, it's not exactly the word of the Prophet, it's the words of the narrators that we come to learn about. When you will make an attempt to tell somebody else what I have spoken, please don't do it. You will not speak my words. You will tell people better than what I have done. But it's not going to be my words. It is never ever possible, except if you really are working hard at memorizing it. Quite often what happens is that the narratives, they don't mention the context. It's just that there is a certain incident, a certain statement that is mentioned, and it is delivered in the name of the Prophet. Then obviously there are problems of memory. People tend to forget what they had heard, what they had observed. And it also happens that a statement is made, but the person who is hearing it or the subsequent narrators are not able to understand what it was, and therefore they communicate to the next generation, they communicated it to the next generation the way they understood it. So all these problems, which are quite natural human problems, they're all there, potentially there, when you are trying to understand Hadith and use it as an information for understanding religion. It resulted in sometimes conflicts with the Quran. You have a piece of information which is saying one thing, and you have the Quran, the book of God, saying quite another. Then the same incident described differently. You have absolutely the same incident, and there are two or more narrators who are talking about it. A large chunk of the description is absolutely identical, but then you find that there are serious differences in some aspects of the description of incidents. That's another problem. And then opinions of narrators also creep in. Everybody has her opinions, and they also sometimes find a place in the description which is attributed to the Prophet. Now, what then is the role of Hadith? Cutting a very long story short, the advantages, the value of hadith on the one hand, the difficulties, the problems in hadith on the other. Hadith seems to be, that's what our understanding is, an important reservoir of information, but it is not the original part of the Islamic message. The core Islamic message is in the Quran and Sunnah, which were made authentic, reliable, 100% certain the way they were transmitted by the Almighty Himself, by the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him. Hadith is a footnote. So you have a text and you have footnotes of the text, which I'm sure you all go through them, which always must agree with the text. So what I'm saying is that hadith does shara of the Quran and it gives farah of the Quran. Now what do they mean? The role of hadith, an example of shara, this is what I omitted, is that there is a famous hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said, Al-Aimmatu min Quraysh. Quraysh are going to be the leaders of Muslims after me. They will be at the helm of the affairs. It's a vastly, it's debated quite a lot amongst the scholars. What we understand is that it was a simple explanation of the principle that is mentioned in the Quran in Surah Shura, Amruhum Shura Bainahum. That is, Muslims, they decide all their matters through mutual consultation. If they agree by vast majority or completely, it's done. Otherwise, it's the majority of them. If one group outnumbers the other, their view is going to be taken as the decision. The Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, he explained that it is the Quraysh who at the moment are the most popular. They are the ones who are going to be followed. They were followed by the Arabian people even during the times of ignorance, Jahiliyyah, and they are the ones who are going to be followed after faith, after Islam. This is also a part of the explanation, which really is what is a practical demonstration of how a Quranic principle was applied practically. Then there are a number of mentions in the Quran. There's a mention in the Quran while Hajj was described, that if somebody has to shave off his head before the animal is sacrificed, which is obviously the wrong sequence, then there are three possibilities mentioned, that one should either fast or should do sadaqah or should make a sacrifice, but doesn't mention numbers, doesn't mention how many. Hadith makes a mention of it, which is something mentioned in the Quran but not in clear numbers. It has been described and clarified in hadith. This is another example. The example of farah, inference, I just give two. Hadiths that tell us that shortening of prayer, qasr, is allowed even when you aren't in a state of fear. The verse 101 of Surah An-Nisa mentions that you are allowed to shorten your prayers if you are traveling and you are in a state of fear. Now, we find in hadith that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, did qasr even when there was no outside fear that was threatening. Now, the inference is that when you are in a state of fear, you cannot focus, you cannot concentrate on your prayers. This is something that can also happen when you are traveling and you are uncomfortable. You cannot fully have the attention that is desired in normal prayers. So this was by inference applied in the case of other prayers when you are traveling. The mention in hadith of the people who were in a state of ihram and were allowed to eat the meat of animals that were hunted. It is mentioned in the Quran that when you are in a state of ihram while going for Umrah or Hajj, you cannot hunt. There was a case whereby some companions were in the state of ihram, others were not. Those who were not in a state of ihram, they hunted and used the meat of the animals and invited their friends who were in state of ihram to have meals with them. They were unsure. When the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, was asked as to whether it was allowed for them to consume meat that was hunted, even though they were in a state of ihram, and they didn't hunt, he asked one question: did you help your friends while they were hunting? They said no. He said, then you can consume. That is, you should not have involved yourselves at all in the act of hunting. If you didn't do it, then the meat which is offered to you by somebody else is okay for you. So there are numerous examples in Hadith wherein what you find is actually linked with the Quran, and the link is in the category of inference drawn. Examples, in my understanding, of incorrect understanding through Hadith. It is mentioned that you kill the one who believed and then didn't believe. If you look at the Quran, this mention of killing is only in the case of when a messenger of God completes his prophetic mission and the message is delivered most clearly and convincingly, and yet there are some people who insist that they are not going to believe and they go on to oppose. The Quran tells us that there is a law, there is a policy, there is a sunnat of the Almighty, that all messengers, their nations who rejected them, were met with God's punishment either through one natural calamity or another, or through the swords of the companions. There was therefore this statement as well, which was an extension of the same law, that if somebody during the lifetime of the Prophet apparently believed to save his her skin and then disbelieved, then the same law would apply. Muslims, many of them, based on Hadith, have generalized it, universalized it. Don't greet non-Muslims with salam. This is another popular attitude of Muslims. Be careful when you meet them, and you might find that they're not very confident when they're greeting you. The reason is that they have a Hadith-based understanding that this is not the way. The fact of the matter is that this is not at all an Islamic expectation. This was an expectation which was mentioned at a time, as I said earlier, when the message had been communicated most convincingly and the deadline had come for those who rejected to be punished. And this was one of the stipulations which was not meant to be generalized, but people, because they take Hadith as an independent source of Islamic learning, they have generalized it, and you can see it in their behavior. I have been sent to fight them until they say La ilaha illallah. That is, there is another Hadith which people mention, more particularly those who are militants, that the Prophet, may God mercy be on him, said, I have come to ensure that this message dominates over all others, and I'll keep fighting them. This again was based on the same law that has been mentioned in the Quran, which was meant to be applicable to the Arabian Peninsula, to the nation who received this message from the messenger directly. Now, obviously, whatever was mentioned was stated by the Prophet, and it was taken and transmitted to the later generations. And when it was taken without any context, then obviously it had its consequences, which we are still facing and going through. This is your subject, Riba al-Fadl. It is a complete confusion as far as I'm concerned. I'm sure that she's looking at it from other angles as well. But my understanding and conclusion is that it was again a problem in transmitting some words from one narrator to another. Riba is only one, and this understanding emerged only as a consequence of some problem in transferring information from one person to the other. By the way, riba al-fadl is actually, riba al-nasiya is that the interest or riba that we know of. There is a time lag and you demand more than the principal amount. But in riba al-fadl it said that it happens even when you are exchanging commodities on spot. So, what does it mean? I don't know. But I'm absolutely clear that there was a problem of communication between two narrators that caused it to happen. The one who doesn't take risk can't take benefit. That's another, misunderstanding, and that's why you have this understanding that if you don't have interest in your banking system, then it should be replaced by profit and loss sharing. You cannot just share in profits, because it is said that if you don't take risk, you can't take benefit. Prohibition of images of living beings and music. Many Muslims believe that images of living beings are not allowed. But they're very keen to take selfies and all those stuff, now. And they come up with all sorts of explanations. But the fact of the matter is that the images that were there for the purpose of being worshipped were condemned, were eliminated, and it was generalized simply because of the fact that the context was not understood. Likewise, all sorts of music people enjoy, but otherwise believe that music is haram in Islam. The fact of the matter again is that the music which causes the emotions, base emotions to be stirred is what was declared haram. That is what emerges from the Quran. Otherwise, the Quran says that all beauty, all kind of beauty is not just halal. The Almighty has created it for you. It's only the one which is obscene, the one which causes you to ascribe partners with God, the one that would harm others, etc., that has been prohibited. Now, that was applied during the time of the Prophet in the case of the music that was prevalent there, belonging to that category, but it was generalized. And description of reward and punishment in the grave is another area, but I would just skip it and would just summarize what I have said. The message of Islam is preserved in the two authentic sources of Quran and Sunnah. Both qualify the test of authenticity. Both have come down to us in a way that they satisfy the conditions of unanimity, ijma, and uninterrupted continuity, tawatur. There was, however, a third source of religious information too that emerged quite naturally. It was the record of the Prophet's life reported by individuals of the first generation to the individuals of the second generation, and so on. It was the record of the Prophet's life which carried both religious and non-religious information. That was checked for its reliability by some scholars, mostly in the 3rd century Hijrah. Books of Hadith thus emerged in the 3rd century Hijrah with varying degrees of authenticity. There were two criteria applied to check whether the text of Hadith was acceptable or not: reliability of narrators, the criterion of riwayat, isnad, sanad, and acceptability of the text, the criterion of darayat. Many Muslims have erroneously considered Hadith as an independent source of religious knowledge. As a result, they employ Hadith to derive religious conclusions. The correct position of Hadith, though, is that it should be considered a footnote explanation of the two original sources of the Quran and Sunnah. When Hadith is taken as an independent third source of religious learning, the religious understanding that emerges on many important issues is very different from the religious understanding that emerges from taking Hadith as a footnote of the two original sources. Just ignore this part. Thank you very much. So we now have something like 15 minutes.
15 minutes, yes, for questions.
For you to ask questions without getting answers.
So maybe I'll ask the first question. Regarding Hadith, I mean, I've heard a common argument that if we doubt Hadith, then we are also doubting Quran, because if we kind of question the transmission of Hadith, then the same people who transmitted Hadith also transmitted the Quran. Hence, we are thereby saying that Quran, may be suspect as well.
I think those people who are very emotional about the question of accepting or not accepting hadith are doing it for two reasons. The name of the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, is mentioned when hadith is presented, and they say that when that great name is mentioned, then it should be respected. Well, the response to it is that because the great name is mentioned, it's all the more important that we verify as to whether we can justifiably claim that it's from him or not. Their emotional response to those who are questioning hadith is actually their confidence in what these scholars have done. When somebody says that, are you challenging hadith? What he's saying is, are you challenging Imam Bukhari? Are you challenging Imam Muslim? Well, the answer is that in some cases, yes, sorry, but they were humans. They were great men. But the fact of the matter is, the fact remains that their work could be questioned, should be questioned. Why? Because we ought to be careful regarding our religion. We must not take in the name of religion anything which is weak and which is not consistent with the Quran and Sunnah, because the Quran and Sunnah were the two sources which the Almighty Himself arranged for them to be preserved.
Can I ask a question then about Sunnah and Hadith? Because, you know, while growing up, and I'm from Pakistan, that's where I grew up, and often, you know, the word Hadith and Sunnah, they use interchangeably. And I think one of the things that, you know, your research and Al-Mawrid Institute's research has done is kind of separate the two and give a clear definition. Could you then tell us what is included in the Sunnah, as opposed to, you know, we know Hadith is vast literature, but what is included in the Sunnah?
All those religious practices which the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, performed, and his followers, the first generation, they knew that it's a part of the package of religion that is being given to them, like prayers, 5-time prayers, Jummah prayer, funeral prayer, the rites of funeral, you know, washing, bathing the dead, giving kafan, clothing the dead, burying the dead, the prayers of Eid, fasting, Hajj, zakat, animal sacrifice. You know, our brother, he greeted with Assalamu alaikum, wa alaikum assalam. You sneeze and you say Alhamdulillah, Yarhamakullah. Lots of practices. Those practices are of the nature that you create a new Muslim community anywhere in this globe. Even go to the moon and you do it there. All those sunnah would emerge. You will have a masjid, it will be directed towards the Kaaba, and so on and so forth. People ask, if you doubt hadith, and probably doubt is not the right word. I've explained it, why hadith has to be looked at from the angle that I'm suggesting. If you doubt it, where then did you get your prayer from? And people who ask this question forget that they too never learned their prayer from books of hadith. They learnt it from their parents, from the masjid, by looking at other people praying. It is another matter that when the Prophet's life, his conduct was described by companions, and it got down to the books of hadith, it was quite natural that, quite apart from many other practices, prayer was also mentioned. How could it have been omitted? But that is one thing, and it's quite another that you claim that we got our prayer from hadith. So what were the people in the first 2 centuries? What were Muslims doing then when there were no books of hadith? So I think my understanding is that because we all love our Prophet so much and we really are emotionally attached to him, somehow it has so happened that we have transferred or connected that love with Hadith. It is as if both are the same. What we are trying to suggest is that if we love him, we should be careful about what we are attributing to him. Most certainly Bukhari and Muslim were very careful, but are we having a blind faith in what they did? We can't do it. So we need to look at everything that they did with respect, but in the light of the Quran and Sunnah. And obviously we will disagree. So if somebody is raising a point, just listen to it carefully. If it makes sense, accept it. If not, well, carry on with what you've been believing and doing.
Yeah.
Please.
I just want to pick up a question about the boundary between the Sunnah and the Hadith again. I can verify your answer. I just want to refer back to some of the things you said about inaccurate hadiths. It seems that if you accept, the argument is that we know what the Sunnah is because that's the first generation and there's a kind of an agreed consensus around certain kinds of practices. But we also know the first generation was also filled with lots of disputes around other kinds of issues. So one would be the leadership of the Muslim community, for example. So the hadiths about the leadership only being the Quraysh. So how do you attribute authenticity or accuracy to one, even though those things are taking part in the context of a dispute, even in the first generation, right at the beginning of the conflict?
Right. You see, the explanation of the hadith of Al-A'immatu min Quraysh is an opinion. Don't accept it. It's something which I have tried to understand in the light of the Quran. However, the basic principle is that whenever you find a disagreement amongst the companions, then it is not Sunnah. By definition, a Sunnah has to be unanimously agreed to. All companions, they agreed to the fact that there are 5 prayers that have to be said every day, and each prayer was assigned a number of units, rakats, which is unanimously agreed to again, and so on. So whenever there is a disagreement, well, that particular claim cannot be Sunnah. In Hadith, obviously, you can have a number of different versions. Sorry.
Dr. Khalid, thank you very much for the talk. I think this may be a useful opportunity for you to explain why the Salafi, modern at least Salafiyya movement, what your critique would be of those involved in the Salafi movement who claim that, well, we are also going back to the original. Of course, not just the companions, but the first few and pious ancestors, generations, and say that in fact we are rejecting the later, what has emerged later on. So what would be your critique?
I think those who are going by that understanding, they are assuming that religion is everything that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, did, and everything that he said and did is fully preserved, which is what we are trying to claim is not the case. I can assure you that there are many other things which the Prophet did which never got reported. For example, I am always very keen to know what exactly were the details of what happened in that all-important journey that the Prophet undertook from Mecca to Medina, which must have been 7 days and 7 nights of journey. The only person accompanying him was Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. He did not mention anything about it. God mentioned more about that journey than we know from him. Why? Because that was his way. He would not share many things with others. Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu despite the fact that he had a very short duration of experience with the Prophet, he mentioned many ahadith. So it happened naturally. What Salafis are saying is that, what I'm criticizing, that what is mentioned in Bukhari and Muslim, etc., authentic ahadith, is all that we know from the Prophet. It's all authentic, and that's what religion is all about. Quite the contrary, what we are saying is that religion, core religion, is in the Quran and the Sunnah, which the Almighty Himself has preserved and has ensured that it should travel from the first generation to the next without any gaps. So, that 200 years of lapse between the compilation of hadith and the Prophet is a big question mark. So I think they have somehow become attached to hadith more than what it deserved. Hadith deserves a lot of respect, but then obviously the Quran has warned us, don't exaggerate in matters of religion. Whenever you would exaggerate, you will be in trouble. So people would exaggerate the status of the prophets and make them equal to God. That would be an exaggeration. Prophets are great, but then obviously they too have a status, a level that needs to be properly understood. Likewise, hadith is great, but let's not exaggerate it. Let's try to place it in its proper position, and that is as a footnote to the Quran and Sunnah. Yes, please.
In terms of the current state of the religious leadership of Muslims, I'm referring to the ulama, do you think that the hadith is being used in many Muslim communities around the world to shore up power, control over knowledge? I mean, would you say we're in a dire state at this moment in time in the 21st?
I would try to stay away from accusing anybody. I think they have been taught in a manner wherein it somehow has been internalized, that when you say Qala Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you're actually mentioning exactly what the Prophet said. Honest to God, to me it's very unfair while quoting hadith to say Qala Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because Imam Bukhari and Imam Muslim, they have done a great service to us in telling us that it was Imam Bukhari who heard from Zubair, and Zubair heard from Sayyid, and Sayyid heard from Abdullah, and Abdullah heard from Abdur Rahman, and Abdur Rahman heard from Abu Huraira. Please mention all these names, and then you will know that people would say, oh, I see. Is that where it's coming from? What people do is unfairly, they say Qala Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This creates an atmosphere, a response wherein you are all in awe. We all hold the Prophet in the highest esteem, and when his name is mentioned and a statement is given, then psychologically you got no way out. So I think it's unfair and it's exaggerated, and that's the way they have been taught. And as we were talking while we were traveling, that what you have learned, the biggest challenge is that you unlearn it. People don't do it, and he was telling me it was because humans are lazy. It's a challenge that you are being told that, look here, what you have been believing in and talking about for the last 30 years, it's wrong. And you're like, come on, forget about it. I'm not going to get into the trouble of learning it again. Yes, she has a question.
Sorry, I keep going back to this question about how interchangeable Sunnah and Hadith are. Are you saying that the Sunnah is an oral tradition? Because obviously the Quran was then eventually written down, the Hadith were eventually written. So have the Sunnah remained oral, or are they also?
Sunnah is completely distinct from Hadith. Sunnah is practice. The Prophet ﷺ prayed, let's say Maghrib prayer. People prayed behind him. When he left this world, Maghrib and all other prayers continued to take place. The new generation emerged, and they also started praying the way they saw their elders praying. That's the way prayer has come down to us. It's there, Sunnah is there in the unanimity of the performance acts of Muslims. Hadith is a completely different information. It was transmitted verbally, and for the first 200 years or so, it was only except for a few exceptions where Mawta Imam Malik was there, and there were some people who also wrote it down, but by and large it was transmitted verbally, written down in books in the 3rd century Hijrah, and it was all information, it was all words, it was the history of the Prophet. You see, the Prophet lived a full life. He was an extremely busy person. There were so many things that happened in his life. Those incidents are mentioned in Hadith. His speech, what he mentioned, is mentioned in Hadith. Some part of what he said had to do with his own private life. Some part of it had to do with what was happening around him. Some part of it had to do with religion as well. Likewise, his practices were also reported. So, Hadith is a superset within which you find the mention of what is Sunnah. But we don't get Sunnah from there. We get confirmation of Sunnah from Hadith as well. But Sunnah was transmitted practically. It is in the nature of Sunnah that it should be communicated practically. You cannot describe in words how to pray. You've got to show what prayer is. That is why when Ibrahim and Ismail alayhimus salam were constructing the Kaaba, they prayed to the Almighty, "Va arena manasikana." Show us our manasik. Don't tell us about them. Show us how are we supposed to go through different rituals. Why? Because what is to be practiced has to be shown through practice. And theory, principles, beliefs, they have to be mentioned in text. So there is a very close contact relationship between the Quran and Sunnah. The Quran mentions that you pray and doesn't go on to describe what prayer is because it's already happening. Everybody knows. Interestingly, the Quran says, while talking about the fact that there are times, hours of privacy, goes on to say, do not enter the rooms of others without seeking their permission, min qabli salatil fajr, before the Fajr prayer, and then goes on to say, min badi salatil isha, after Isha prayer, without mentioning, clarifying what these prayers are. Why? Because they were happening. So there was no point in telling people as to what they mean. Something that is already happening is what is already known. So there is a very strong relationship between the two. Hadith mentions information about the same happenings and much more. What was observed by some people, I repeat, some companions, not all of them. And they also communicated only what they felt like communicating. I just to alarm you or give you another perspective. What is mentioned in Bukhari and Muslim, I personally feel absolutely confident that this entire information was not even known to Abu Bakr Raziyallahu anhu, because he had interaction with the Prophet on some occasions, but not on all occasions. He must not have been present on some occasions when there were others who were present, who saw certain things happening and they reported. How can this be an absolutely essential, vital part of religion? It is brilliant. We value it. We are not rejecting it. But for God's sake, place it in its right position. And the position that I am assigning very humbly is the position of a footnote. I think it helps in understanding Hadith the way it deserves to be understood. Sir? There was a hand raised there, yeah, and there as well. How is it possible that you talk about Hadith and talk controversial stuff about Hadith and people don't ask? No, sorry.
There's huge ecumenical value in the thesis that you presented today, especially as Hadith is being used to justify so much division, and lest there's a fear that your presentation and separating Hadith from Sunnah is to further fragment. Actually, can you speak a little bit more about the ecumenical potential of your thesis?
I think if Muslims care to understand as to how the religion of God was presented by the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, himself. You see, I don't know, I often have this problem in appreciating as to why don't Muslims as well as non-Muslims spend some time to imagine what was the strategy adopted by God and his companions to transmit this message. Once you start understanding that methodology that was adopted by them and do away with your emotions for the timing, which is not an easy task to do, you will find that the picture begins to emerge very clearly and things start falling into their respective proper places. My understanding is that if it is properly communicated, far from it being divisive, it's going to bring people together. We are acutely aware of the fact that what we are doing is potentially problematic, and therefore we keep telling ourselves, not that we keep practicing it, but at least we keep telling ourselves that we simply cannot afford to be emotional. We've got to be very polite and academic in telling our fellow brothers and sisters that, look here, this is what the correct position is. Because why would we not do enough to know what the scheme of presentation of this religion was? We have gone too far in valuing Hadith. Hadith is valuable, but do not exaggerate it. When you will exaggerate it, then, now this is very important, when you will exaggerate it, you will not understand God's religion the way it is. You will not do justice with the manner the Prophet transmitted the message, this religion. So I think it's extremely important that don't accept what I'm saying. Give it a serious thought, and let's keep revisiting it, because quite obviously Islam could not have been presented 200 years later for Muslims to know what their God expects from them. It was there right from the beginning. It is an allegation against the message of Islam that in the first 200 years, the most vital part of information about Islam was not there available to everybody. You would? Yeah.
If Sunnah is backed up by Ijma and Tawatur, like you were saying, then how do you reconcile the existence of divergences in one practice, as like the existence of madhabs?
Right. Mazhabs are based on a number of factors, one of which is differences in practices. So your question, obviously, in response to my lecture, is relevant to that part. You see, let's talk about prayers. The formal prayer salat has two components. One was made binding, the other was non-obligatory. The binding part is absolutely, completely agreed upon by all Muslims. The non-binding part is understandably is what people disagree about. Rafa Yadain, for example, was made non-obligatory. It seems that the Prophet, may God's mercy be on him, did it, and on occasions he didn't do it. All that you can debate is whether at the later part of his life he was doing it or not doing it, or whether he did more of Rafa Yadain or not. Likewise, holding your hands here or not at all, and many other practices. So Sunnah is not all obligatory. One part of Sunnah practices was made binding and obligatory, the other was not, and therefore there are differences in the other. I'll give you an example. You see, animal sacrifice after Umrah was also a part of religion, something which probably the Ummah has forgotten, but it was not obligatory. So what is not obligatory, you can choose not to do, but it is the obligatory part which I insist there is no disagreement. So much so that, the famous, the big, most prominent two groups, Sunnis and Shias, there is a difference in the manner they pray, but the Shia prayer is also 5 prayers. What they do, their opinion is that the two can be joined together, which Sunnis also do when they do qasr. So there is no disagreement. The best example probably is Hajj. There is no mention of the fact that Hajj begins with 8th of Zulhajj in the Quran. But it starts from there. It couldn't have gone wrong. There has been no gap of even 1 year. And it was happening right from the beginning, at least from the times of Ibrahim alayhi salam. Likewise is the case of all practices.
Yes, just wanted to say, I'm conscious of time as well. Just wanted to say thank you very much to Dr. Zaheer for a very illuminating talk, and I'm sure that we will all carry on reflecting about it. And thank you very much to the audience as well for your interest and your questions. We have a break for about 45 minutes.
Yeah,
about 45 minutes, and we're back here at 1 o'clock for the